It's pretty mild to think that a simple discount on laser hair removal could spiral into a case that goes all the way to a nation's highest court. But that's exactly what happened. In this explainer, we're going to unpack a really fascinating legal battle out of Taiwan. And it really makes you think, right? Where do you draw the line between a good deal for a patient and a potential risk that the government feels and needs to step in and prevent? It's a classic story, a doctor, a fine, and a huge debate over freedom versus protection. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been offered one of those package deals at a clinic, maybe for some kind of cosmetic treatment? They'll say something like, hey, pay for 5 sessions up front and we'll throw in the 6th one for free. It seems totally normal, right? Just smart business. Well, as one clinic in Taiwan found out the hard way, the law can have a very different opinion on that.
Okay, so let's get right into it. We're going to start at the very beginning. Honestly, this whole case is a perfect example of how a decision that seems so simple, just offering a discount for paying in advance, can blow up into this massive legal challenge. It literally pits a doctor's freedom to run their business against the government's duty to protect people. So here's the play-by-play. It all kicks off back in October 2017. A patient walks into the Belgian Glow Clinic and buys a 6-session laser hair removal package. Pretty standard stuff. But then, a little while later, bam, the head doctor gets hit with a fine. And that one fine, it kicks off a legal fight that winds its way through the court system for years, all the way up to the Constitutional Court in 2024. They weren't just arguing the fine anymore, they were questioning the law itself. And we're talking about a 50,000 new Taiwan dollar fine here. That's around $1,500 US. Now, what's really important to get is that this wasn't for bad service. The laser worked, the patient was fine. The whole issue was about how the clinic got paid. See, the government's argument was that by bundling those sessions into a prepaid package, the clinic had essentially created a brand new fee item. And that fee item needed official approval, which they never applied for. So when faced with this fine, the clinic didn't just write a check and call it a day. Oh no, they decided to fight back. They argued that the fine wasn't just unfair, it was flat out unconstitutional. Their whole case rested on this idea that the regulation was a massive overreach, that it stepped on their fundamental rights to run a business and make contracts with their patients. But, of course, the government saw things from a totally different angle. For the Ministry of Health and Welfare, this had nothing to do with trying to restrict business. For them, it was all about one core responsibility: protecting the public, protecting them from financial risks and from medical decisions that might be driven more by a sales pitch than by actual medical need. And this is where we get to the heart of the matter, the real clash of principles. On one side, you have the clinic saying, look, this law is way too vague and it's unfairly tying our hands. But on the other side, the government's argument is just as powerful. They're saying, no, this rule is absolutely essential. We need it to protect patients from being taken advantage of and to deal with what's called information asymmetry. And that's just a fancy way of saying something we all know is true. The doctor always knows way more than the patient. So the clinic's argument, when you boil it right down, was pretty simple. They were like, a payment method is not a medical procedure. They were doing a service that was already approved. They were just offering a discount if you paid ahead of time. So making them get a whole separate approval just for a package deal, they argued that was just bureaucratic overreach that was choking their business. Now, the government fired back saying, hold on, this isn't about banning packages or discounts at all. Their whole point was that any kind of fee structure, especially when you're paying upfront, has to be looked at. Why? To make sure the package is actually medically justified, and not just some clever marketing gimmick to lock a patient into a long and maybe even unnecessary series of treatments. So there you have it. 2 really compelling arguments going head-to-head, a doctor's freedom on one side and patient protection on the other. So how did Taiwan's Constitutional Court rule? This was a big one. Their decision was going to set a huge precedent for the entire private medical field. Okay, so the court was super methodical about this. They broke their decision down into a few key steps. First, they looked at whether the law was actually too vague, like the clinic claimed. Second, they had to figure out if the government's rules were fair and, proportional to the problem they were trying to solve. And once they had answers to those 2 big questions, they were ready to hand down the final verdict. Right, so on that first point, the idea that the law was too vague, the court basically said, nope, we don't buy it.
They ruled that the standard for clarity isn't for you or me, the average person on the street. The law is written for medical professionals. And the court's take was that any doctor should be able to understand that the term fee item includes not just a single treatment, but also these bundled packages or treatment courses.
Then we get to the second point, this idea of proportionality. And again, the court sided with the government. It decided that, yes, requiring pre-approval for these packages is a fair and reasonable restriction. Why? Because of that information asymmetry we talked about. Since the doctor holds all the cards, knowledge-wise, the court said these kinds of regulations are necessary to shield patients from financial pressure and to make sure the treatment is really needed.
And all of this built up to the court's single most important ruling. They made it crystal clear. In the eyes of the law in Taiwan, a prepaid treatment package, or a liao cheng, is now officially considered its very own fee item, a shou fei xiangmu. And what does that mean? It means it absolutely needs its own separate government approval before a clinic can offer it. Plain and simple. Now look, this verdict was about way more than just one clinic's fine. This was a big deal. It essentially clarified the rules of the game for the entire private medical industry in Taiwan, especially in cosmetics. So the big question is, what does this actually mean for doctors and for patients from here on out? And here's the thing that really backs up the government's whole argument. This law was never meant to be a total ban on packages. And we know this because other clinics have been getting them approved all along. We can see right here that approvals were granted for things like whitening packages, and even for 6-session hair removal packages, the exact kind of deal that started this whole mess. It shows the system is there, and it works. You just have to follow the rules. So let's break down the key takeaway here. The bottom line is this. Clinics in Taiwan can definitely 100% still offer package deals and discounts. But, and this is a big but, they now have a very clear legal duty to get that entire package, the whole liaocheng, approved as its own unique shoufei hianmu before they offer it. So when it came to that balancing act between freedom and safety, the court drew a clear line in the sand. Patient protection comes first. So yeah, this case really drew a clear line, at least in Taiwan. But it leaves all of us with a much bigger, more universal question, one that every healthcare system on the planet struggles with. Where is that perfect line between a doctor's freedom to run their business and the government's duty to keep its people safe? This court gave its answer, but you can bet that this debate is far from over. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.